An orphan rescued a stranded baby rabbit, never realizing it was the beloved pet of a grieving queen. In the quiet village of Elderbrook, where morning mist clung to cobblestone streets like memories reluctant to fade, 12-year-old Eliza Morgan huddled beneath the threadbare blanket that did little to shield her from the biting autumn chill. The orphanage attic, her designated sleeping quarters since the arrival of 3 new children last month, whistled with drafts that found every gap in the worn wooden beams. Dawn had barely broken, painting the sky in hesitant strokes of pale pink and gold, but Eliza was already awake. Sleep rarely came easily to her. Not since the accident that had claimed her parents 3 years ago. Not since Mrs. Blackwood, the orphanage matron, had deemed her too old, too quiet, and too peculiar. For most prospective parents to consider, better to make yourself useful rather than desirable. Mrs. Blackwood often told her when catching Eliza lost in daydreams. Pretty stories don't put bread on the table. Eliza slipped from her cot, careful not to wake the 2 other girls who shared the cramped space. At 12, she was the eldest child at Blackwood House, and with age came responsibilities, stoking the kitchen fire, preparing breakfast porridge, and completing morning chores before the younger children stirred. Her fingers, red and chapped from washing endless piles of laundry, fumbled with the buttons of her faded gray dress, once her mother's favorite color, like dove feathers. She had said, now merely the uniform required by the orphanage. Eliza kept one small treasure hidden in her pocket, a silver thimble that had belonged to her mother, a seamstress whose gentle hands had created wedding gowns for the finest ladies in the province. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet as she descended to the kitchen, each step a familiar note in the morning's melancholy symphony. Through the small window above the wash basin, she could see the sprawling royal forest that separated humble Elderbrook from the magnificent capital city of Lunaria, where the palace spires pierced the clouds like gilded needles. The kingdom had fallen quiet over the past year. The celebrations and festivals that once filled the calendar had ceased when the king died suddenly, leaving his young wife, Queen Cordelia, to rule alone. Rumors spoke of a queen locked in grief, appearing rarely and speaking even less. Such sorrows seemed fitting companions to Eliza's own, though she would never dare speak such thoughts aloud. The November morning was unusually bitter, the kitchen stone floor like ice beneath Eliza's thin-soled boots. As she knelt to kindle the fire, her breath clouded before her, ghost-like and transient. The matches were damp, and it took 3 precious strikes before the kindling caught. When the flames finally bloomed, Eliza held her palms toward the warmth, allowing herself 10 heartbeats of comfort before reaching for the heavy porridge pot. "Girl!" Mrs. Blackwood's sharp voice shattered the momentary peace. The matron stood in the doorway, her tall figure blocking what little light filtered through from the corridor. "The royal forester will be delivering wood today. You're to collect wild herbs for the week before he arrives. Take your basket and be quick about it. There's talk of storms coming." Eliza nodded, swallowing her disappointment. The forest excursions were normally reserved for spring and summer, when the ground was soft and plants abundant. November woods offered little beyond the occasional hardy rosemary or stubborn thyme clinging to life, yet the prospect of solitude beckoned like a rare gift. In the forest there were no critical eyes, no demands beyond the simple task of filling her basket. There, among ancient trees that had witnessed countless human sorrows, Eliza could pretend, if only for an hour, that she was simply a girl taking a morning walk, not an orphan performing her duties. "And Eliza," Mrs. Blackwood added, her tone softening almost imperceptibly, "stay on the marked paths. The royal hunting party passed through yesterday. Wild animals may be wounded and dangerous." Surprised by this unusual display of concern, Eliza murmured her assent. After setting the porridge to cook and laying out the bowls for breakfast, she took her worn wicker basket from its hook and wrapped her thin shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The wind had picked up, carrying the first hints of winter's approach. The forest welcomed her with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, a rich, earthy perfume that filled her lungs and momentarily eased the constant ache in her chest. Eliza followed the familiar herb-gatherer's path, her eyes scanning the ground for anything useful. Occasionally, she would pause to listen to the forest sounds, the conversation of birds, the whisper of branches, the scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. The gathering proceeded slowly. As expected, the forest floor yielded little, but Eliza took her time, savoring these moments of freedom. She hummed softly, a half-remembered lullaby her mother once sang, letting her fingers trace the rough bark of oak trees and smooth stones along the path. An hour into her task, with her basket still disappointingly light, a strange sound broke through her reverie, a high-pitched, distressed squeal unlike any bird call she knew. Eliza paused, tilting her head to locate its source. The sound came again, weaker this time, from a thicket of brambles several yards off the path. Common sense urged caution. Wild animals, especially injured ones, were unpredictable. But something in that plaintive cry tugged at a place deep within her, a recognition of pain that transcended species. Before she could reconsider, Eliza found herself pushing carefully through the thorny bushes, wincing as they caught and tore at her dress and shawl. In a small clearing beyond the brambles, partially hidden beneath a fallen log, lay a tiny creature. At first glance, Eliza thought it was a common wild rabbit, but as she knelt beside it, she noticed several unusual features. Its fur was not the typical brown or gray, but a soft cream color with unusual silvery markings around its eyes that resembled tiny stars. Around its neck was what appeared to be a thin blue ribbon, now muddied and torn. The rabbit trembled violently, a small gash visible on its hind leg. It appeared young, barely more than a baby, and terrified. When Eliza cautiously extended her hand, it flinched but made no attempt to flee, too weak or too frightened to move. "You're someone's pet," Eliza whispered, noticing how the creature's eyes, unlike the wary gaze of wild rabbits, seemed to focus directly on her face. "Did you escape? Or were you abandoned?" The rabbit's pink nose twitched, its breath coming in rapid, shallow pants. Something about its helplessness broke through Eliza's carefully constructed emotional walls. How many times had she felt equally lost and afraid? How many nights had she lain awake, wounded in ways no one could see, with no gentle hand to soothe her fears? "I won't hurt you," she promised, keeping her voice soft and even. "I know what it's like to be alone." With slow, deliberate movements, Eliza removed her shawl and gently wrapped it around the trembling creature. The rabbit stiffened momentarily before relaxing into the warmth of the fabric, its heartbeat a frantic rhythm against her palms. A pang of protectiveness surprised her with its intensity. "Mrs. Blackwood won't approve," Eliza murmured as she nestled the bundled rabbit into her basket among the meager herbs she'd gathered. But she need not know. Not right away. As she carefully made her way back to the path, the first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the canopy of leaves above. The promised storm was arriving. Eliza quickened her pace, one hand steadying the basket against her hip, the other holding her dress above the rapidly muddying ground. By the time Elderbrook's crooked chimneys came into view, rain was falling in earnest. Eliza was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her dress heavy with water. Yet the bundle in her basket remained relatively dry, protected by the layers of her shawl and the basket's overhanging lid. She slipped through the orphanage's back entrance, grateful to find the kitchen momentarily empty, as the children would be at their morning lessons. Leaving puddles in her wake, Eliza hurried up the servants' stairs to the attic, her heart pounding with the twin fears of discovery and concern for the injured rabbit. In the attic's dim privacy, she unwrapped her unexpected charge. The rabbit lay still within the folds of the shawl, its eyes half closed, its breathing shallow but steady. The blue ribbon around its neck was actually a delicate collar, Eliza realized, with a tiny golden charm attached, a crescent moon, tarnished but unmistakable. "You belong to someone wealthy," she whispered, fingers hovering over the charm without touching it. "Someone who must be missing you terribly." The right course of action was clear. She should report finding the rabbit, perhaps to the village constable or even the royal forester when he arrived with the wood. Someone would know of a fine household missing an unusual pet. Someone would claim this small creature and perhaps even offer a modest reward for its return. Yet as the rabbit's eyes fully opened, revealing irises of unusual violet blue, Eliza felt the first stirrings of a different desire. Here was a living being that needed her, not her labor or her service, but her care. Here was something she could nurture and protect, something that might, in its own small way, ease the crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion. "Just until you're stronger," she rationalized, even as a part of her recognized the dangerous temptation of attachment. "Just until the wound heals." From an old candy tin beneath her thin mattress, Eliza retrieved the few precious items she'd managed to salvage from her former life. a handkerchief embroidered with wildflowers, a stub of beeswax candle, and a small jar of salve her mother had made for scrapes and burns. The herbal ointment was 3 years old, but its scent, lavender and comfrey, remained potent. With trembling fingers, she cleaned the rabbit's wound using drops of rainwater collected in a chipped cup from a leak in the roof. The rabbit remained surprisingly docile, flinching occasionally but offering no resistance as Eliza applied a thin layer of salve and bound the injury with a strip torn from the cleanest part of her handkerchief. "I'll bring you water and something to eat when I can slip away again," she promised, creating a nest from her spare nightgown in the corner furthest from the drafty window. "You need a name, don't you? At least while you're my guest." The rabbit's unusual markings glimmered in the weak light filtering through the attic window. The silvery fur around its eyes captured what little brightness existed in the dreary space. "Luna," Eliza decided, thinking of the moon charm on the collar. "I'll call you Luna." As if in approval, the rabbit's ears twitched forward. For the first time in years, Eliza felt the corners of her mouth lift in what might, with practice, become a true smile again. Miles away, in the royal palace of Lunaria, Queen Cordelia stood motionless before the rain-lashed windows of her private chambers. At 26, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone much older, as though the weight of the crown physically bore down upon her slender shoulders. Once celebrated throughout the kingdom for her vibrant spirit and radiant smile, the queen now moved through her days like a pale shadow, fulfilling her duties with mechanical precision while remaining emotionally unreachable. "Your Majesty?" Her lady-in-waiting spoke from the doorway, her voice carefully measured. "Captain Thornfield has returned from the forest search. He requests an audience." Cordelia did not turn from the window. "Send him in." The captain of the royal guard entered with a bow so deep it nearly hid the regret written across his weathered face. "Your Majesty, I regret to report that despite our most thorough efforts, we have found no trace of Stellaris. The storm has washed away any tracks that might have remained." The queen's reflection in the window glass remained impassive, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her black morning gown, clenched until her nails bit into her palms. "The hunt continues at first light?" she asked, her voice betraying no emotion. "Of course, Your Majesty, though I must advise that after 3 days, and with the predators in the forest." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the grim thought. Cordelia finally turned, fixing the captain with eyes as cold and gray as the November sky. "Stellaris was a gift from my late husband on our last anniversary. She is the only living thing he touched that still draws breath. You will continue the search until I command otherwise." The captain bowed again. "As you wish, Your Majesty." When the door closed behind him, Cordelia allowed herself one small gesture of weakness, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Beyond the palace walls, the forest stretched like a dark sea toward the distant villages. Somewhere in that vastness was the last connection to the man whose death had left her not only a widow, but a reluctant queen, bound by duty to a kingdom she had never aspired to rule alone. "Where are you, little one?" she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "What stars are you following now?" For 3 days, Eliza maintained her secret with increasing difficulty. Luna's presence in the attic required elaborate precautions, creating distractions to bring food upstairs, inventing reasons to check the attic during the day, and fashioning a crude feeding area from discarded items that could be quickly hidden. The rabbit was healing remarkably quickly. By the 3rd day, it hopped cautiously around the confined space, exploring corners and occasionally nuzzling Eliza's hand when she sat beside it during her precious free moments. "You're getting stronger," Eliza observed as she fed Luna a cabbage leaf smuggled from the kitchen. "Soon you'll be well enough to—" She didn't finish the sentence. The thought of returning the rabbit had become increasingly painful. In those 3 days, something profound had shifted in Eliza's carefully ordered emotional landscape. For years she had protected herself by expecting nothing, wanting nothing, caring for nothing beyond immediate needs and duties. But Luna had awakened something dormant within her, a capacity for tenderness she had deliberately suppressed since her parents' deaths. Each morning, she found herself rushing through chores, her thoughts constantly returning to the attic and its small occupant. Each night, she fell asleep with the rabbit nestled against her side, its steady heartbeat a comfort in the darkness. "The orphanage remained cold, Mrs. Blackwood remained stern, the other children remained distant, but Eliza had found a pocket of warmth in a world that had long seemed determined to freeze her heart. On the fourth morning, disaster struck. Eliza was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard Mrs. Blackwood's heavy footsteps on the attic stairs. The wooden spoon slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, clattering against the porridge pot. "Martha," Mrs. Blackwood's voice echoed down the stairwell. "Bring me the broom and dustpan at once. There's animal waste up here." Eliza's heart lurched painfully against her ribs. She hadn't had time to clean the attic that morning, having overslept after staying awake late watching Luna's increasingly playful antics. Without conscious thought, she found herself running, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She reached the attic door just as Mrs. Blackwood emerged, her face flushed with anger. "Miss Morgan, what is the meaning of this? There's an animal in the attic. Please, Mrs. Blackwood," Eliza gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "I can explain?" But explanation became unnecessary as Luna, perhaps frightened by the commotion, darted through the open door and directly between Mrs. Blackwood's skirts, causing the matron to shriek and stumble backward. "Catch that filthy creature!" she commanded as Luna bounded down the stairs with surprising speed. What followed was chaos. Children emerged from their rooms, squealing with delight or fear as the rabbit dashed through the orphanage's narrow hallways. Eliza pursued desperately, knocking over a small table and narrowly avoiding collision with the cook. Luna, displaying unexpected agility for a recently injured animal, evaded every attempt at capture. When the front door was momentarily left open by the arriving laundress, the rabbit seized its opportunity, bolting into the misty morning and disappearing into the village beyond. "Luna," Eliza cried, rushing to the doorway only to be yanked backward by Mrs. Blackwood's firm grip on her collar. "You named the filthy thing?" The matron's voice trembled with barely controlled rage. "You brought vermin into my orphanage, where children sleep and eat." "She's not vermin," Eliza protested, tears burning behind her eyes. "She was injured. I was helping her heal." Mrs. Blackwood's face reddened further. "And where, pray tell, did you find this injured creature?" "In the forest during the herb gathering." "The royal forest? Where hunting takes place?" The matron's voice rose with each question. "Where signs clearly prohibit interference with any animals. Where taking anything without permission is considered theft from the crown." The blood drained from Eliza's face as the implications became clear. She had not considered that rescuing an injured animal might be viewed as theft, certainly not theft from the crown itself. Mrs. Blackwood's grip on Eliza's collar tightened. "Go to my office. Now. We must discuss your punishment and pray that no one discovers what you've done, or it won't be just bread and water for a week you'll be facing." As she was marched toward the matron's office, Eliza cast one last desperate glance toward the open door and the village beyond. Somewhere out there, Luna was alone again, still healing, still vulnerable. The thought was like a physical pain in her chest, sharp and insistent. For the first time in 3 years, Eliza allowed herself to cry. Captain Thornfield dismounted wearily, handing his rain-soaked cloak to a waiting stable boy. 5 days of searching had yielded nothing but exhaustion, and the growing certainty that the Queen's beloved pet was lost forever. Now he faced the unenviable task of suggesting to Queen Cordelia that the search be called off, a conversation he anticipated with dread. As he crossed the palace courtyard, a commotion near the servants' entrance caught his attention. A cluster of kitchen staff had gathered, their excited voices rising above the persistent drizzle. "What's happening here?" he demanded, approaching the group. The crowd parted, revealing a junior cook cradling something small and cream-colored in her apron. "It's a rabbit, sir," she explained, eyes wide with wonder. It appeared at the kitchen door, soaking wet and shivering. "But look." She carefully turned the animal to display a muddied blue collar with its crescent moon charm. "It's Stellaris, the Queen's rabbit." Thornfield's fatigue vanished instantly. He stepped forward, examining the bedraggled creature with careful hands. The distinctive star-like markings around the eyes were unmistakable, though partially obscured by mud. Around one back leg was a crude but effective bandage, now filthy and unraveling. "Someone's been caring for her," he observed, fingering the makeshift bandage. "But who? And why not return her to the palace?" These questions, however intriguing, were secondary to the immediate need to inform the Queen. Thanking the cook and instructing her to bring fresh vegetables to the royal chambers, Thornfield carefully took the rabbit and hurried through the palace corridors, his mud-splattered boots leaving tracks on the polished marble floors. Outside the queen's private study, he paused to catch his breath before knocking. "Enter," came the queen's voice, flat and remote as it had been since the king's death. Thornfield stepped inside, keeping the rabbit partially concealed behind his cloak. Queen Cordelia sat at her writing desk, quill poised over a document, her face a careful mask of composure. "Your Majesty," he began, bowing as protocol demanded, "I bring news regarding Stellaris." The quill froze mid-stroke, a drop of ink blooming on the parchment like a dark tear. "You've found remains?" The question was barely audible. "Better than that, Your Majesty." With a smile he couldn't suppress, Thornfield brought the rabbit forward. "Stellaris has returned to us." The transformation that overtook the queen's face was nothing short of remarkable. The careful mask cracked, then shattered completely as she surged to her feet, the document forgotten. For a heart-stopping moment, Thornfield glimpsed the young woman who had first arrived at court 7 years ago, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with emotion, movement quickened by genuine feeling rather than ceremonial requirement. "Stellaris," she gasped, hands outstretched but hesitating, as though fearing the rabbit might be an illusion that would vanish at her touch. The rabbit's ears twitched at the sound of the familiar voice. When Thornfield carefully placed her in the queen's trembling hands, Stellaris immediately nestled against Cordelia's chest, her nose burrowing into the black fabric of the morning gown. "Oh, my little star," Queen Cordelia whispered, stroking the muddied fur with gentle fingers. "Where have you been? What adventures you must have had." She sank back into her chair, cradling the rabbit as tenderly as a mother might hold a child. Only then did she notice the crude bandage. "She's injured? And this?" Her fingers traced the dirty fabric. "Someone has been caring for her." "So it appears, Your Majesty." She arrived at the kitchen door just moments ago, seemingly having found her own way home. The queen examined the bandage more carefully. "This is handmade, simple but effective. Not the work of a trained physician, but someone who took great care nonetheless." Her voice softened further. "Someone with a kind heart." She looked up suddenly, her eyes sharper than Thornfield had seen them in months. "I want to know who helped her, who found her in the forest and tended to her wound instead of—" She didn't complete the thought, but both knew what often happened to animals caught in hunting areas. "I'll investigate, Your Majesty," Thornfield promised with another bow. The villages nearest the forest would be the logical place to begin. Perhaps someone saw something. "Yes, do that." For the first time in a year, there was animation in the queen's voice, purpose in her directive. "And, Captain, when you find this person, I wish to thank them personally. They shall be rewarded for their kindness." As Thornfield withdrew, he glanced back to see Queen Cordelia press her cheek against Stellaris's head, her eyes closed, the rigid posture of months finally yielding to a moment of genuine peace. Eliza's punishment had been severe but not unexpected. For a week, she had been confined to the orphanage, assigned the most unpleasant tasks, scrubbing chamber pots, cleaning the chimney flues, scraping crusted food from the undersides of tables and benches. Her meals had been reduced to bread and water, her free time eliminated entirely. Worse than any physical discomfort was the hollow ache of loss. Luna was gone, and with her, the brief flame of connection that had warmed Eliza's days. She found herself listening for tiny paws on the wooden floors, looking up expectantly at small sounds from the attic, reaching out in her sleep for a warm, furry body that was no longer there. "It's better this way," she told herself during the long nights. She wasn't mine to keep. But the rational thought did little to ease the pain. Something had changed inside her. A door once firmly closed had been forced open, allowing feelings to rush through like floodwaters through a broken dam. Now, trying to return to her previous state of careful emotional numbness felt not like a refuge, but like another kind of death. On the 8th day after Luna's escape, as Eliza was hanging laundry in the orphanage yard, the clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones drew her attention to the street beyond the iron fence. A royal guard in the distinctive blue and silver uniform of the palace stopped before the orphanage gates, his magnificent white horse stamping impatiently. "Mrs. Blackwood hurried from the house, smoothing her apron and hair as she went. "Captain!" What an unexpected honor. "How may Blackwood House be of service to the crown?" The captain, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and kind eyes, surveyed the yard before answering. "I'm investigating a matter for Her Majesty." A pet rabbit belonging to the Queen was lost in the royal forest approximately a week ago. It has since been recovered, but showed signs of having been cared for during its absence, specifically a bandage around an injured leg. Eliza froze, the wet sheet in her hands dripping unnoticed onto her shoes. Luna, or rather Stellaris, had belonged to the Queen herself. The revelation sent a wave of dizziness through her, forcing her to grip the clothesline for support. Mrs. Blackwood's smile remained fixed, though her eyes darted briefly toward Eliza. How fascinating. But I fail to see how we at the orphanage might assist with royal pets, Captain. The Queen believes someone from one of the villages bordering the forest may have found and temporarily sheltered the rabbit. She wishes to express her personal gratitude to this individual. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the children who had gathered to stare at his magnificent horse. Has anyone here perhaps mentioned finding a cream-colored rabbit? It has unusual star-like markings around its eyes and wore a blue collar with a moon charm. In the terrible silence that followed, Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, rapid and insistent. Mrs. Blackwood's back had stiffened, her hands clutching her apron with white-knuckled intensity. The right course of action was clear. Eliza should remain silent. Admitting to having taken the rabbit would only confirm that she had unwittingly stolen royal property. At best, it would bring further punishment from Mrs. Blackwood. At worst, it might involve the village constable or even imperial law. Yet something stronger than fear pushed against her ribs, demanding recognition. The Queen, a figure remote and mythical in Eliza's mind, had lost something precious. She had suffered, was still suffering according to village gossip, from the pain of her husband's death. And now she sought the person who had helped, however briefly, ease the suffering of a creature she loved. The wet sheet slipped from Eliza's fingers as she stepped forward. It was me, sir. I found the rabbit, Stellaris, in the forest 5 days ago. She was injured, hiding under a fallen log. Mrs. Blackwood made a strangled sound of dismay, but Eliza continued, the words tumbling out with unexpected force. Her leg was bleeding. I bandaged it with a piece of my handkerchief and some of my mother's healing salve. I kept her warm and fed her for 3 days until she escaped. She swallowed hard. I didn't know she belonged to the Queen. I just couldn't leave her there, hurt and frightened. The captain studied her with new interest, taking in her faded dress, her work-reddened hands, her thin face pale with apprehension. What is your name, child? Eliza Morgan, sir. And you cared for the Queen's rabbit without knowing who it belonged to? Yes, sir. I saw the collar but didn't recognize the moon charm as a royal symbol. I thought perhaps it belonged to someone in the village or a passing traveler. The captain dismounted in a fluid motion, approaching until he stood directly before her. You kept it secret? Eliza glanced at Mrs. Blackwood, whose expression had transformed from dismay to outright alarm. Yes, sir. Mrs. Blackwood doesn't permit pets in the orphanage. I knew I should have reported finding her, but... She faltered, uncertain how to explain the depth of her attachment to the rabbit without sounding childish. But you'd grown fond of her, the captain finished, surprising Eliza with the gentleness in his voice. Yes, sir, she whispered. I called her Luna because of the moon on her collar. Something in the captain's face softened further. Luna. A fitting name given the circumstances. He straightened, addressing Mrs. Blackwood with formal courtesy. Madam, by order of Her Majesty Queen Cordelia, I must request that Eliza Morgan accompany me to the palace immediately. Mrs. Blackwood's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. The palace? But Captain, surely there's some misunderstanding. Eliza has confessed to taking royal property. Surely this is a matter for the village constable, not the royal court. On the contrary, the captain replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her Majesty specifically commanded that the person who helped Stellaris be brought to her for a personal audience. The Queen does not make such requests lightly. He turned back to Eliza, whose heart had begun a terrified fluttering beneath her ribs. There's no cause for alarm, Miss Morgan. The Queen wishes to thank you, not punish you. But we must not keep Her Majesty waiting. Is there anything you need to collect before we depart? Eliza could only shake her head, too overwhelmed to speak. Mrs. Blackwood, seeing an opportunity to salvage the situation, hastily intervened. She cannot possibly appear before the Queen in her work clothes. Allow me a few moments to find something more suitable. The captain glanced at the darkening sky. 5 minutes, madam. No more. What followed was a flurry of activity as Mrs. Blackwood hustled Eliza inside and up to the girls' dormitory, hissing urgent instructions as she went. You will be respectful. You will be humble. You will thank Her Majesty for her gracious forgiveness of your trespass. You will bring no shame upon this orphanage, do you understand? She thrust Eliza's Sunday dress, a plain brown garment with fewer patches than her everyday clothes, into her arms and turned to rummage through a trunk of donated items, emerging with a faded blue ribbon. "For your hair," she explained tersely. "Now hurry." 4 minutes later, Eliza stood beside the captain's horse, her hair hastily tied back with the ribbon, her Sunday shoes pinching her toes, her hands trembling so badly she could barely accept the captain's assistance in mounting. "Hold tight to my waist," he instructed as he swung up behind her. It's not a long journey, but the horse moves quickly. As they set off through the village streets, drawing curious stares from every window and doorway, Eliza felt suspended between terror and a strange, unexpected exhilaration. She was going to the palace. She was going to meet the queen. Because of Luna, no, Stellaris, a creature who had bridged the vast gulf between the lowest and highest members of the kingdom. The journey passed in a blur of sensation, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait, the wind tugging at her ribbon, the gradually changing landscape as village gave way to forest road, and forest road to the broad royal highway leading to the capital city of Lunaria. When the palace finally came into view, its white stone walls gleaming like pearls in the late afternoon light, Eliza gasped audibly. No building in Elderbrook stood more than 2 stories high. The palace soared toward the sky, its towers and spires adorned with flags that snapped in the breeze, its windows reflecting the sun like countless stars. "Impressive, isn't it?" the captain remarked over his shoulder, slowing the horse to a walk as they approached the outer gates. Even those of us who see it daily never quite grow accustomed to its beauty. Eliza could only nod, speech momentarily beyond her capacity. As they passed beneath the great arch of the main gate, guards in gleaming armor saluted the captain, their curious gazes lingering on the small figure seated before him. The palace courtyard bustled with activity, servants hurrying on errands, nobles in fine clothing ascending and descending the grand staircase, gardeners tending the immaculate flower beds that lined the pathways. Eliza had never seen so many people moving with such purpose, never heard such a variety of voices and languages, never smelled such a blend of scents, flowers and spices, leather and perfume, horses and baking bread. When they reached the inner courtyard, the captain dismounted and lifted Eliza down with careful hands. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly, noting her wide eyes and pale cheeks. "Yes, sir," Eliza admitted. There seemed little point in pretending otherwise. The captain smiled, a warm, reassuring expression that momentarily reminded her of her father. "There's no need. The queen can be remote, even stern, but she is not cruel. And she truly cares for that rabbit. You've done her a great service whether you knew it or not." He led her across the courtyard and up the imposing marble staircase, through massive doors carved with scenes of the kingdom's founding, and into a high-ceilinged entrance hall that made Eliza feel smaller than she had ever felt in her life. Guards stood at attention, servants bowed as they passed, and courtiers in elaborate clothing paused in their conversations to stare at the strange procession, the captain of the guard escorting a thin, plainly dressed girl through the heart of the royal palace. After what seemed an endless journey through corridors and antechambers, each more magnificent than the last, they reached a set of double doors flanked by guards in the Queen's personal livery of silver and midnight blue. "Captain Thornfield to see Her Majesty as requested," the captain announced. "With Miss Eliza Morgan of Elderbrook." The guards opened the doors without comment, revealing a chamber that, while smaller than the great halls they had passed through, was no less impressive in its elegance. Tall windows overlooked the palace gardens, filling the room with golden afternoon light. The walls were lined with bookshelves interrupted only by paintings of landscapes and royal ancestors. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, dispelling the November chill. And there, seated in a high-backed chair near the fire, was Queen Cordelia. Eliza had seen the Queen only once before, during a royal procession through Elderbrook 3 years earlier. Then, Queen Cordelia had been newlywed, radiant in her happiness, smiling and waving to her subjects from a flower-decked carriage. The woman before her now seemed like a different person entirely. still beautiful, with her copper-colored hair and fine features, but altered in some fundamental way. Grief had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the skin beneath her eyes. The black morning gown she wore emphasized her pallor, making her seem almost ghost-like against the rich colors of the room. Yet as they entered, Eliza noticed something that the village gossip had not mentioned. In the queen's lap, contentedly nibbling a carrot slice, sat Stellaris. The rabbit looked transformed from the bedraggled creature Eliza had found in the forest. Her cream-colored fur was clean and brushed to a silky sheen, the star-like markings around her eyes clearly visible. A new blue ribbon collar encircled her neck, the crescent moon charm gleaming in the firelight. "Your Majesty?" Captain Thornfield began, bowing deeply. "May I present Miss Eliza Morgan of Elderbrook Orphanage, who found and cared for Stellaris during her absence." The Queen's eyes, a clear gray that reminded Eliza of winter skies, fixed upon her with unsettling intensity. "Step forward, child." Remembering Mrs. Blackwood's instructions, Eliza managed a wobbly curtsy before taking 3 hesitant steps closer to the Queen's chair. Up close, she could see faint lines at the corners of the Queen's mouth and eyes, lines that spoke of smiles once frequent but now rare. "You found my rabbit in the forest?" Queen Cordelia's voice was soft but precise, each word carefully formed as though she had grown unaccustomed to extended conversation. "Yes, Your Majesty," Eliza replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. 5 days ago, during an herb-gathering expedition, she was injured and hiding beneath a fallen log. "And you took her home with you, to an orphanage where pets are forbidden?" Eliza swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Majesty. I couldn't leave her there, hurt and alone." Something flickered in the Queen's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. Even though it meant breaking rules? Risking punishment? "I didn't think about that at the time, Your Majesty. I only thought about helping her." The Queen's hand moved to stroke Stellaris's back, her fingers tracing the spot where Eliza's crude bandage had been. "You bandaged her wound?" "With part of my handkerchief and some healing salve my mother made before she died. It was all I had." "And you called her Luna?" This detail seemed to interest the Queen particularly. "Because of the moon charm on her collar," Eliza explained, warming slightly to the conversation despite her nervousness. "I didn't know she was royal. I thought perhaps she belonged to someone in the village or a traveler passing through." Queen Cordelia's gaze never left Eliza's face. "What would you have done had you known she was mine?" The question caught Eliza by surprise. She considered it carefully before answering, instinctively sensing its importance. "I would still have helped her, Your Majesty, but I would have brought her to the palace instead of keeping her secret." "Even though you had grown attached to her?" Eliza nodded slowly. "She wasn't mine to keep. I knew that even when I thought she might belong to a villager, but—" She hesitated, uncertain whether to continue. "Speak freely," the Queen encouraged, her voice softening further. "But I would have been sad to part with her," Eliza admitted. "She was good company. She listened when I spoke to her. She made the attic feel less empty." Something in the Queen's carefully composed expression shifted, a subtle softening around her mouth and eyes. "Stellaris has that effect. She has been my comfort this past year, when comfort has been hard to find." Eliza couldn't imagine what it meant to be a queen in mourning, to bear both personal grief and public responsibility. Yet in that moment, she recognized in Queen Cordelia something unexpectedly familiar, the same loneliness that had been her own constant companion. "I'm glad she found her way back to you, Your Majesty," Eliza said with complete sincerity. The Queen studied her for a moment longer before turning to Captain Thornfield. "Leave us, please. Return in half an hour to escort Miss Morgan back to Elderbrook." The captain bowed and withdrew, leaving Eliza alone with the Queen and Stellaris. As the door closed behind him, Queen Cordelia rose from her chair, still cradling the rabbit in one arm, and moved to a small table near the window. "Come, sit with me," she instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" Eliza perched on the edge of the indicated chair, acutely aware of its silk upholstery against her plain cotton dress. "No, thank you, Your Majesty." The Queen smiled faintly. A diplomatic answer. "But I suspect it's not entirely truthful." She lifted a small bell from the table and rang it once. Almost immediately, a side door opened and a servant appeared. "Tea," the Queen requested, "and some of those almond cakes from this morning." As the servant disappeared to fulfill the request, Queen Cordelia carefully transferred Stellaris to Eliza's lap. The rabbit immediately settled into the familiar position, nose twitching as she investigated the scent of the orphanage that still clung to Eliza's clothes. "She remembers you," the queen observed. Rabbits have excellent memories for those who are kind to them. Eliza couldn't suppress her smile as she gently stroked Stellaris's soft ears. Hello again, little one. You look much better than when I found you. Tell me about yourself, Eliza Morgan, the queen said, seating herself in the chair opposite. How long have you been at Elderbrook Orphanage? 3 years, Your Majesty. Since I was 9. And before that? I lived with my parents in the village. My father was a carpenter, my mother a seamstress. The familiar ache of loss welled up, dulled by time but never truly absent. They died in a fire that destroyed our home while I was staying with a neighbor during their illness. The queen nodded slowly. So you understand what it means to lose those you love? It wasn't a question, but Eliza answered anyway. Yes, Your Majesty. And to find comfort in unexpected places. The queen gestured toward Stellaris, who had closed her eyes contentedly under Eliza's gentle stroking. Yes, Your Majesty. Queen Cordelia leaned forward slightly, her gaze intent. Do you know why Stellaris is so precious to me, Eliza? Captain Thornfield mentioned she was a gift from His Majesty the King. She was the last gift my husband gave me before his illness took him. The queen confirmed, her voice steady despite the painful subject. He knew how much I missed my childhood pets since coming to court. Palace life can be isolating, despite being surrounded by people constantly. Stellaris was his way of ensuring I had a companion who wanted nothing from me but my affection. The tea arrived, carried by 2 servants who arranged the service on the table with practiced efficiency before withdrawing silently. The queen poured 2 cups herself, rather than summoning a lady-in-waiting, a gesture whose significance was lost on Eliza, but would have astonished any courtier. When she escaped during a garden walk last week, I felt as though I had lost the last living connection to him. Queen Cordelia handed Eliza a delicate porcelain cup, yet she returned to me because of you, because you showed kindness to a creature in need, without thought of reward or recognition. Eliza accepted the tea carefully, terrified of spilling or breaking the fragile cup. Anyone would have done the same, Your Majesty. No, the queen said with quiet certainty. They would not. Many would have ignored her suffering. Some might have seen an opportunity for profit. Others might have helped but immediately sought praise for their good deed. Her gaze sharpened. You kept her secret, risked punishment, and would never have come forward had Captain Thornfield not specifically inquired at the orphanage. Heat rose in Eliza's cheeks under the queen's perceptive assessment. I didn't do it to be praised, Your Majesty. Precisely. Queen Cordelia selected one of the small, elaborately decorated cakes from the tray and placed it on a plate for Eliza. That is why I wish to meet you personally. To thank you, yes, but also to ask you a question. Stellaris shifted in Eliza's lap, perhaps sensing her sudden tension. The queen's tone had shifted, becoming more formal, more deliberate. Would you be willing to leave Elderbrook Orphanage and come to the palace? Queen Cordelia asked directly, not as a servant, though you would have duties appropriate to your age, but as Stellaris's caretaker and companion, and perhaps in time as my companion as well. The teacup trembled in Eliza's hand, tea sloshing dangerously close to the rim. The queen gently took it from her and returned it to the table. I don't understand, Your Majesty, Eliza stammered, certain she had misheard. I am proposing to become your guardian, Queen Cordelia clarified, her voice gentle but resolute, to provide you with education, proper clothing, and a place here at court. In return, you would help care for Stellaris and spend time with me when my duties permit. It is not adoption in the legal sense. That would create complications with the succession that the council would never permit. But it would be a home, Eliza. A real home. The unexpectedness of the offer left Eliza speechless. She looked down at Stellaris, who gazed back with those unusual violet blue eyes that had first captured her heart in the forest. Then she looked at the queen, whose composed expression could not entirely mask the hope and uncertainty behind the offer. Why me? Eliza finally managed, the question barely audible. Queen Cordelia's smile held a hint of genuine warmth for the first time. Because you loved something that I love, without knowing its value to anyone but yourself. Because you showed courage and compassion when there was no reward for doing so. Because, her voice faltered momentarily, because this palace has too many people seeking favor, and not enough seeking simply to be kind. She reached across the small table, hesitantly extending her hand. And because I think perhaps we both understand what it means to be surrounded by people, yet feel entirely alone. Eliza stared at the offered hand, pale, elegant, adorned with a single ring bearing the royal crest. the hand of a queen, reaching across the vast divide that separated their worlds. In her lap, Stellaris stirred, pressing her warm body against Eliza's stomach as if offering encouragement. With a trembling hand of her own, work roughened, chapped from lye soap and cold water, Eliza reached back. "I would be honored, Your Majesty," she whispered, tears blurring her vision as their fingers touched. "Truly honored." The Queen's hand closed around hers with surprising strength. "Then welcome to your new home, Eliza Morgan. I think we have much to learn from each other." Spring came early to the kingdom of Lunaria that year. By March, the palace gardens were already thick with crocuses and daffodils, their bright colors a stark contrast to the previous year's somber atmosphere. Gardeners noted that the Queen, who had once avoided the gardens that reminded her too painfully of walks taken with her late husband, now spent time there daily, often accompanied by a slender girl and a cream-colored rabbit on a blue ribbon leash. Court gossips observed other changes as well. Queen Cordelia had begun to emerge from deep mourning. While she continued to honor the king's memory, she had gradually incorporated midnight blue and then silver back into her wardrobe. She appeared more frequently at public functions. Most notably, she smiled again, not the practiced royal smile of official portraits, but genuine expressions of pleasure that transformed her face and reminded older courtiers of the vibrant young woman who had first arrived at court. The girl who accompanied her, neither quite servant nor quite noble in status, was the subject of much speculation. Some said she was a distant royal relative fallen on hard times. Others claimed she was the daughter of a foreign dignitary, placed at court to learn the kingdom's customs. A few even whispered that she possessed magical abilities, having enchanted both the queen and her unusual pet. The truth, known only to a few trusted members of the royal household, was both simpler and more extraordinary than any rumor. Eliza Morgan, former orphan of Elderbrook, had become an integral part of palace life through nothing more magical than genuine kindness and the unexpected bond formed with a lost rabbit. On a particularly fine April morning, Eliza sat on a stone bench in the Queen's private garden, watching Stellaris explore a patch of clover. 3 months at the palace had transformed her almost as much as it had transformed the Queen. Regular meals had filled out her once thin frame. Proper clothing, lessons in deportment and etiquette, and the patient guidance of Queen Cordelia had given her confidence she had never imagined possible. Yet, in essential ways, she remained unchanged, still observant, still compassionate, still capable of finding joy in simple pleasures like watching Stellaris's antics among the flowers. "There you are." Eliza looked up to see Queen Cordelia approaching along the gravel path, dressed not in formal court attire, but in a simple blue walking dress. Without the elaborate hairstyle and ceremonial jewelry she wore for public appearances, the Queen looked younger, more approachable. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Eliza greeted her with the courtesy that had become automatic over the past months. While Queen Cordelia had encouraged her to use less formal address in private, Eliza still found it difficult to think of the most powerful woman in the kingdom as simply Cordelia. The Queen seated herself on the bench beside her, watching Stellaris with evident affection. "She grows more adventurous every day. Soon she'll be exploring beyond the garden walls if we're not careful." "I've been training her to come when called," Eliza replied. "Watch this." She made a soft clicking sound with her tongue against her teeth. Immediately, Stellaris's ears perked up, and she hopped back to the bench, rising on her hind legs to place her front paws on Eliza's knee. Queen Cordelia laughed, a sound that had once been rare in the palace but was becoming increasingly common. "Remarkable. You have a gift with her. She's very intelligent," Eliza demurred, stroking the rabbit's silky head. "She remembers everything, like her caretaker." The Queen reached into her pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in silver paper. "I have something for you. An early birthday gift since I'll be traveling to the northern provinces next week." Eliza accepted the package with surprise. Though the Queen had been unfailingly generous, providing clothing, books, and educational opportunities beyond anything Eliza could have imagined at the orphanage, personal gifts were unexpected. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but how did you know when my birthday is?" "I don't recall mentioning it. I asked Captain Thornfield to obtain the records from Elderbrook." Mrs. Blackwood was quite detailed in her documentation, if nothing else. There was a hint of disapproval in the Queen's voice whenever she mentioned the orphanage matron. Curious, Eliza carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small silver box with the royal crest engraved on its lid. When she opened it, she gasped softly. Inside lay a delicate silver pendant on a fine chain, a crescent moon cradling a star, each point of the star set with a tiny pearl. "It's beautiful," she whispered, lifting it from the box to examine it more closely. "Look at the back," the queen instructed. Eliza turned the pendant over to find an inscription in flowing script, "For E.M. Second chances come in unexpected forms. With gratitude, C.R." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes as she read the words. "I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything." Queen Cordelia took the necklace and motioned for Eliza to turn so she could fasten it around her neck. "But I hope it will remind you that kindness, even to the smallest creatures, creates ripples that can change lives in ways we never anticipate." The pendant settled against Eliza's collarbone, cool at first but quickly warming to her skin. Stellaris, perhaps sensing the emotional moment, hopped into her lap and settled there, a warm, living connection between Orphan and Queen. "When I found her in the forest that day," Eliza said softly, "I was so alone. I thought I was rescuing her, but really—" She touched the pendant gently. "Really, she was rescuing me." Queen Cordelia's hand came to rest briefly on Eliza's shoulder, a gesture that would have shocked the court had anyone witnessed it, but felt entirely natural in the quiet of the garden. "Perhaps we were all rescued that day. Stellaris from her injury, you from the orphanage, and I—" She paused, looking out across the garden where spring was asserting itself with determined beauty. "And I from the prison of grief I had built around myself." Stellaris stretched contentedly in Eliza's lap, her nose twitching in the mild breeze that carried the scent of new growth and possibilities. The rabbit who had unwittingly bridged worlds, connecting Orphan and Queen, poverty and privilege, loss and renewal, had no understanding of the lives she had transformed. She knew only that she was safe, she was loved, and the hands that held her were gentle. For Eliza Morgan, who had once believed that happiness belonged only in the stories Mrs. Blackwood had dismissed as useless, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. "Second chances," she agreed, her finger tracing the inscription on her new pendant, as Stellaris dozed in her lap and the Queen's profile softened in the spring sunlight. "They really do come in the most unexpected forms."